something. Well, it's Systems Management Research Unit's pleasure to host Professor Tierney from Tel Aviv University. And, well, I shall be handing over to Dov now for questions later, right? Or do you...
I don't mind.
Okay. Carry on.
So it's rather informal, right?
Yes, yes it is.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me, for organizing this. I appreciate it very much. So you can guess that I'm from the information systems side of things. But here I'm stepping out a little bit out of my domain of IT and talking about knowledge and knowledge management with hopefully very strong implications on IT. So you can draw me wherever you want, to whatever direction you want. If there's anybody interested in IT, I'd be very happy to discuss the implications on IT, because I think today information technology really doesn't do a very good job of supporting the process of knowledge development and knowledge sharing. So that's actually the motivation behind the whole thing. But let's start with this idea of knowledge maturation, where I'm going to expand in a while. And the trend today, because I feel I'm going a little bit against the trend today of seeking knowledge outside the organization. And sometimes it's called sourcing from out, or outsourcing. I just heard of a very interesting study by, I can't remember the name of the lady, I think it was Harvard, and she studied the way NASA today is seeking knowledge or solutions to problems in developing their technology from the crowd out there, outside the organization. Because that's the feeling that the more we collaborate and the more we use crowdsourcing, the better we'll be in this day and age of the internet and globalization, etc. And I want to try and go back to the good old-fashioned organization and see what are the strengths that organization can supply to innovate. So it's a bit of maybe a conflicting idea here, trying to be innovative in the old-fashioned way, but let's see what I mean. So, first of all, I'm going to give credit to my colleagues here. They're both French. Valérie was the person inside the organization that actually collected all the data and brought to our attention all kinds of issues that we tried to frame and theorize about. France was his mentor, a good colleague of mine, and I'm just here to deliver. Okay. So the title is a little fancy, knowledge maturation, a new term. I'll tell you in a minute what it is, but basically we're talking about development of knowledge in the context, which is perhaps a little limited, but it gives us a lot of strength in terms of defining the constructs here, new product development. So I know a few of you, I don't know exactly whom, but I know a few of you are in project management. So these are all projects to develop products. Okay. And we'll talk about it in a minute. So in this particular context, I'm talking about knowledge maturation, and knowledge networks is simply networks of people engaged in the product development. And what I'd like to do, and this is, I think, where the main contribution is, trying to characterize, in this particular context, what is the motivation to develop and share knowledge, and try and draw, and I'll show you these diagrams, of patterns of knowledge maturation, and talk a little bit about consequences. This is still work in progress. I got a few nice results, I think, conceptually and supported by some empirics. And I also got the beginning of an analysis of the more quantitative aspects. And there I'm looking for good ideas for the analysis. Okay. A bit of background. And this is, again, a little, I would say, going against the trend, but what we try to do is to look at how people create and share knowledge and talk about the knowledge networks within the organization. We hardly touch on collaborations or knowledge sharing from the organization out and from out into the organization. And we talk about knowledge, individual knowledge creation only to a point. What does that mean? This is a strong assumption, I think, but one that I truly believe in. When we talk about creative people developing new products, innovating, at some point, this creative thinking cannot develop further unless they share information. That's our assumption here. And I will tell you in a minute what sharing means, but basically it's not only transmitting the information from one place to another, but it's willing and risking to float ideas, get feedback, sometimes critical feedback, go back to working as an individual, going back forward to working with groups, and then larger and more formal groups. That's the kind of knowledge sharing I'm talking about. And this idea that we can, and sometimes it's done, we can say there is individual thinking and there is group thinking or organizational thinking. I think that simply doesn't stand in the test of reality. So I'm going to lump them together. And looking at it from a knowledge perspective, we show how a dual perspective, and I don't know if these terms are familiar, safety and effectiveness, these are two interesting concepts that have been used to characterize knowledge sharing, or the motivation for knowledge sharing. I'll talk about this in a minute. And as I said, introduce this term knowledge maturation. We'll talk about that in a minute. And the empirics are, well, let me expand that in a minute, but basically, this is a firm, a company in France, which is known to be a very innovative producer of home appliances. So I mentioned earlier NASA, which is rocket science, and home appliances might seem a little bit simplistic, but we find when we go deeper into the processes of an innovative company that produces home appliances, and every time something new and competing, that there's a lot to be learned. Okay, so that's the intro. Let me expand a little bit on this idea of safety. Oh, well, I'm going to jump. How long do I have? Roughly an hour?
About 50 minutes, 55 minutes.
Okay. The idea of safety and effectiveness has been used in the more quantitative studies of social networking between organizations. And as you know, networking today is a big field of study, an important concept. And the idea is that we look at networks that are very cohesive and strongly related one to another within that network versus parts of the network that are loosely coupled. For example, tightly coupled would be within a particular department that one person knows each other and talks to each other, versus the weak ties might be way out of the organization in some other competing or collaborating company that together they could bring up new ideas that they could not do separately or by themselves. So the effectiveness, and this is inconclusive, but that's the the flavor of some of the findings. And if you look at these huge networks of developers or innovators, and very often these are big networks that produce and are measured by patents or other measures of innovation, what you find is that the people that seek out knowledge far away from those weak connections in other places in the world, they are the people or the agents that manage to come up with new ideas. And the logical explanation is because those people out there come from far away perspectives too, with new ideas, new ways of looking at the same problem. However, the safety is that part that explains that part of our behavior when we look to nearby people who we can trust. Very often they have the same perspective as we are. So they might help in certain ways, but very often the guys that think differently might be a better source for new ideas. The people close to me might be very helpful in implementing those ideas. So these are tentative, these are not my conclusions, but these are conclusions, temporary or inconclusive conclusions about this balance between safety, where I'm looking for the close relationships, versus effectiveness, where I'm reaching out to find new worlds. Okay? I'm going to be using these terms here in the organizational context, and I'll show you how. By the way, are there any psychologists in the room? I'm going to be careful when I say change. It's very much an in-depth study that the data led us in various ways, sometimes unexpected. But originally we wanted to look at the interplay between formal and informal relationships between actors in the organization. We had a sense that knowledge can be managed, but only to a point. So there's all this talk about how to promote innovation. And we think some of it can be done. Some of it can actually be supported and designed with IT. But some of it is left to the actors, and perhaps what we can do is create a certain environment or atmosphere, but not much more than that. That was our initial entry point, and then very quickly we started flowing with these ideas of knowledge maturation as a mean of gaining effectiveness, and looking at this safety as some kind of guardian, because we are willing to risk and go out and find that faraway information, as long as it doesn't in some way intimidate or compromise on our safety, and I'll explain. I also went one step further and looked at effectiveness, and I'll show you the definition in a minute, at a more organizational level, and the safety coming more from the personal aspect. All right, now let's start with definitions. And here it becomes a little abstract. I'm not sure everybody's going to buy into it. I bought into it already in 1994, when I worked with Richard Boland on distributed cognition, we called it. And this is what we thought then and what I think now about knowledge. There's no way that we can talk about, I know we do, talk about organizational knowledge as one big lump of knowledge that we can store somewhere and take it and use it and manipulate it. The way we look at knowledge is much more fragile. A web of interrelated understandings of parts of organizational reality. We're very careful about talking about this sacred idea of knowledge. Fragmentary, tentative, evolving, and loosely linked understandings that comprise of organizational knowledge. Well, the idea behind this is that we want to look at small parts of the knowledge, see how they develop, and not worry right now about this huge lump of information and knowledge. This is a little tricky, and some people might be skeptical about this, but we think that that's how reality is. And let me explain. An ensemble, and this now I'm talking about knowledge maturation. An ensemble is very proximate, the word I stress here, proximate maturation process, geared towards some goal, tending to ignore considerations and sources that are distant in time and place. Behind this bombastic is simple, and anybody in project management or product development, I think, can relate to this. When an engineer has a particular task, or manager has a particular task, and they need for that task some skill or knowledge to accomplish that task, they are focused on that task. And the knowledge that is necessary to solve a particular problem is what they are concerned about. And they develop that knowledge to the point that they can implement it, and that's it. And they don't. Most people engaged in solving or developing a product don't do knowledge development for the benefit of the organization. They are there to solve a particular problem, and anything else, and that's why we call it myopic, anything besides that is discounted. Okay, so that's this people, and this is not us, Leventhal and March, say that the minute you're focused, everything else, people tend to ignore considerations and sources that are distant from that goal. And we use that. And that's probably the trick behind this whole study, that we are working in an environment, like product development, where the goal is very clear. We need to develop a product, and we usually need to develop it in time to compete. And the knowledge that I'm going to be talking about is geared towards accomplishing that goal in stages because of the organizational context, and I'll talk about that as well, gives that framework how and when we need to develop each step of the product. Okay, so in NPD, new product development work, actors use artifacts representing explicit knowledge. So here I'm getting to where we got what we were able to monitor and collect data. This is how people usually work. They have these artifacts or representations that show or represent explicit knowledge. I'm using the word explicit because in a minute I need to draw attention also to the implicit knowledge, such as all these familiar objects: schedules, minutes, functional specifications, budget, drafts. All these, to us, are, in a minute I'll call them, knowledge objects. And of course you can understand that what we did is we traced what happened to these knowledge objects. So these knowledge objects represent basically the future product, and the closer we get to the final product, hopefully our representations will reflect more accurately the final product. So if you think about some prototype, eventually that prototype will be as close as we can get to the final product. But before that, we have designs and conceptual thinking, which is less accurate representation. These representations become clearer and more focused and more accurate as we develop our knowledge. And here's our definition. Knowledge objects are proximate knowledge processes. These are processes, you can't think about them as objects that are easily taken from one place to another, transferred as the old metaphors of communication. There's some communication experts here. Okay, knowledge objects are proximate knowledge processes, and I explained what proximate is, that are designed to reach a level of maturity sufficient for solving the immediate word goal. And we'll see that. So, for example, this, if we take a draft drawing of the product, the minute it is sufficient to use that to solve a particular problem, then that's it. The knowledge is mature. That's our definition. Okay, so these are more visible ways of looking at these objects, and you probably recognize them. Everybody in project management, of course, knows that there's something like called, every organization has maybe a little different term, but technical specifications object. So this would be some kind of diagram with all kinds of instructions. This is more developed. They call it a 3D object. It's probably, which is not probably, is based on this, but it's added all kinds of physical characteristics, materials, etc. Okay? And there are other objects. But these are the objects that we traced. Okay, so here comes, I'm going to devote 5 minutes now to the framework, and I'll then expand each part of the framework. This is the more theoretical or conceptual way that we look at knowledge maturation. So anybody looking at this spiral and knows a little bit of knowledge management, the word Nonaka jumps to mind. So what Nonaka said years ago was that when we look at the development of knowledge, we look at some kind of interaction between tacit knowledge that we have in our brains and explicit representation, some people call it explicit knowledge, that we have out there specified, written, or dictated, or whatever. And there's not only an interaction, but there's a spiral that involves more and more people, more and more different views, going backwards and forwards, and that's how people develop knowledge. It's a very famous model. I'm sure some of you know it and use it. And we're going to use it, and around this we built some additional layers, but this is the core. In this particular context, when I told you that we're myopic, this leads to something that is sanctioned or something that is agreed on, or at least known in the organization or in the circles of the project, that yes, this knowledge is good enough to act, as I said, to solve the problem. That's this technique. And in this organization, and you'll see that, there was a very formal way of ensuring that knowledge cannot just be applied. It has to be applied when it's considered mature. And when is it considered mature? When people agree that it's mature. Okay. So around this, we build a larger model or framework. And this is it. And this is the main contribution of the paper. So I'll go through this. First I'll give you an overview, then I'll go into the components. So this is the core, as I said. But this, in this organization, happens or occurs in the context of at least 2 major dimensions. I like to call it place and time. So let's start with for the benefit of the project managers. Product development has a life cycle. Whatever you want to call it, there are different life cycles, but they are all based on some sequence of steps. And basically, we adopted one, the one that was used in this particular company, and it was scoping, business case, development, validation, and launching. I take it people have different labels for that, but the idea is that we go from the more abstract and slowly take more and more considerations into account until we can launch it into the market. This is product development lifecycle. And as I said, we're talking about new product development lifecycles, some of them very drastically different to the older ones, some of them like major enhancements to old products, but there's always some development that requires new knowledge. So this is one dimension in which this core process happens. The other dimension, which is to us a new way of looking at things that I think will be acceptable to you, is what we call knowledge networks. Basically, circles of actors inside the organization. At the beginning we call them circles of trust. We wanted to allude to the idea that people interact with each other, first with the people who are more trustworthy in their minds, and then they slowly expand it till they are willing to talk to the entire organization. And I'll explain that by looking at safety and effectiveness. But the idea here was to simplify these networks into, if you will, levels or stages. One, personal, when I work by myself as an individual. One, and it's an informal, intimate network, which is what we call interpersonal, where usually I interact with a small circle of people that I trust. And then, and this is formal, in this particular organization it jumped from interpersonal, which is not defined anywhere in the organization, but in practice we saw it, to the formal project. The project is defined formally by the organization. There's a head of a project, there are resources, there's a goal, and this is really formal. And then there's the entire organization or enterprise. So these are the different networks. What I'm going to try and do is show you how this process here, the core process, behaves or develops in light of these two dimensions. We also, and this was more by evolving or data dictativeness, we found that we need to also look at the different characteristics of projects. Projects were varied in very drastic ways, so we had to take a look at that as well. And then we also added this idea of motivation. Why do people engage in this process? And try to look at some consequences. Let me just share with you a minute each of the major components. I'm not going to talk much about characteristics and consequences, but I will certainly can entertain your questions. So, let's go back to safety and effectiveness. The effectiveness. These are the motivations or drivers of knowledge maturation. Effectiveness. At the organizational drive is the motivation to generate knowledge that can be applied successfully to achieve work goals. Pretty straightforward. And that's the bulk of why people share, if at all. Why they share information. Because they understand that they need to, or they're told to. Knowledge maturation implies understanding and refining knowledge, but also adopting it and acting on it. That's important. Implies more accurate representations, more integrated dimensions. Basically what this means is that you can develop a product with some basic knowledge to some point, but at some point you need to take into account, up to now, for example, you took only marketing perspective. Now you need to take into a more technical perspective. And within technical perspectives, you sometimes need to look at purely functionality, and then somebody adds aesthetics. So the knowledge matures usually in correlation with more and more perspectives. That's the reality of developing a new product. So this is the clear, I would say, obvious and most popular way of explaining why people share. But if you will, in the background, to us it's pretty much in the forefront as well, even though it might carry us a lighter weight, is this idea of safety. And safety safety might be, the connotation might be a little narrower than I want to talk about here. Safety is this. If I don't feel safe in sharing information because I might lose my job, because somebody else might take my knowledge and simply replace me at a lower rate, a lower salary or whatever, as simple as that. Or I might embarrass myself, which is, sometimes people downplay that. But apparently it's a big, I might be embarrassing myself right now, right? Floating these ideas in front of you. So if I didn't want to embarrass Jody, I would just say some other things. But no, I want to try and not embarrass myself. Now seriously, if I want to be safe, I very often will go to people who I know won't ridicule me, or won't laugh at me, or won't go behind my back and tell my boss, look, the guy doesn't know what he's talking about. Yeah. All this happens for political or psychological or whatever reason. In academia, I think we're much freer with this idea of coming up and presenting a seminar, even though I would assume, and I encourage my authors when they submit to a journal, to first talk to people who they trust and are not too embarrassed, and get feedback. And that's what I'm doing here. In real life, very often, people don't do that and simply close in until they're forced. So this, I believe, this balance between effectiveness and safety can go a long way in explaining how people actually share information. Okay. I'm going to look at knowledge maturation. Up to now, I looked at this more philosophical aspect of how I look at knowledge in terms of more fragmentary rather than holistic. But now let's consider a minute about the people perspective. And I said our assumption was that we can develop knowledge by ourselves. To a point beyond that, we need these networks. That's the assumption, and it proved to be a useful assumption in analyzing what happened in this friend company. So that's basically the word hermeneutic circle. Is, to those of you who know it, means that ties very nicely into this idea of fragmentary and evolutionary look at knowledge. Things don't stop, they go on all the time. We continue in dialogue all the time. And if we look at knowledge as we used to look at it in the days of data, where there's one correct piece of data in the information system, and if we, God forbid, have two variants of the same item, that's somebody made a mistake. Okay. That's the opposite of what we're looking here. Here we're saying there might be different ways of looking at the world. The guy who's interested in aesthetics of the product versus the guy who's looking at the functionality of the product, they might both be right, but they look at it in different ways. And this hermeneutic circle means that this knowledge keeps developing, I don't want to use the word improving, but changing, developing in light of this dialogue of more and more people engaged in enriching the representation. Okay. Now there's a catch. If you buy into this idea of safety, or people sometimes afraid, then there's a little catch here. What is it? Knowledge maturation requires sharing. But very often, when are people really afraid or feel unsafe to share? When the ideas are half-baked, when they're in the process of developing. That's really when we need the feedback. That's really when we need to share. So if we don't share, we'll never get to the point that we mature. And if we don't mature, we'll never share. We need to break this. And how we rate this, and this is a nice introduction to the two dimensions of context. Well, one is formal coercion to share. That's used all the time. And in academia, we don't like the word coercion, right? And with your chairman here, I don't want to talk. Okay. What we do in practice, though, is we have deadlines, and you'll see this very clearly in this case study, where people know exactly when they have to share, because if not, the project is halted. Stop. And people will get somehow punished if they don't share. And the way most organizations do it is through the life cycle. Okay. And when the life cycle is somehow implemented through some information system, then you are nagged and told, why haven't you shared the information? And your boss already knows about it, that you haven't shared by the 22nd of January, although it says that you have to. But there's also the informal circles of trust, and here this gets into the knowledge networks. We believe that if we can promote this idea of being able to share knowledge the way I want to share, taking into consideration safety as well, then we will be able to break this vicious catch-22 that doesn't promote, doesn't lead to knowledge sharing. Okay, so the knowledge network in a word, I already said it, just more pragmatically. Knowledge networks are not only the mechanisms through which knowledge flows, they interactively affect and are affected by the knowledge maturation process. What we see is a very dynamic view of the organization. It's not enough to look at the hierarchy of an organization, a firm within the organization, departments, underneath the departments maybe sections. That can help the formal side of knowledge coercion, I mentioned earlier. But when we talk about sharing knowledge, taking into account also informal relationships, then we have to go to a much more dynamic view, because these dynamic or intimate circles, they might change. I've got a few friends here in this campus. Sometimes I turn to somebody in chemistry, and sometimes I turn to somebody in biology. I've got these networks, but they develop according to what I'm doing and what kind of project. And according to a lot of other factors as well that have got nothing to do with the project. So that's what I mean, affected by. Very often they have a life of their own. Okay, I'm not going to talk about the other dimension, which is, I mentioned it already, the product lifecycle. Can you tell me how?
20 minutes.
Okay, I want to get. Okay, so before I introduce where we got to, let me just give you another word about the context. As I said, it's a French company, an industrial group, very big, and we concentrated in part of it is only about the appliances, only on the units that develop appliances for linen care. So you can imagine it's really, really big. And the focus of the analysis was this. We started with 4 projects, and then we have altogether 12, but the majority of the rich data that I'll show you pertain to 4 projects. NPD process for 4 projects, duration of each project around 10 months to develop the product. And knowledge objects, out of many objects, the first 4 were only the 3D drawings. In a minute I'll give you the diagram showing you the context of the 3D drawings. And so here are examples of the different 3D drawings. And now what we're going to do is try and trace the development of such object. The data collection, these are the variables, if you will, that we measured or collected data. Knowledge maturation, and this is the luck of, sometimes you're lucky, sometimes you're not lucky with field work.
This particular organization, and in a minute I'll show you exactly how, had a stamp on each of these objects. What is the status of its maturity? They didn't call it maturity, but in a minute I'll show you what they did. And we also managed to construct patterns of knowledge maturity, or knowledge maturation, sorry. The knowledge networks, remember, individual or personal, interpersonal, project, organization. Some of them were given, like the organization is given, the projects are formally defined by the organization. We had to construct the interpersonal, and we'll show you how. The life cycle given by the company, I'll show you the different steps. This is an example of project characteristics. There's a famous study, or several studies on, it's called Psychological Safety by Edmondson. You heard of it? So you can actually measure the level or the climate within an organization, or in this case within a project, of how safe people feel, how willing they are to share knowledge. It's a questionnaire or a set of interviews that can tell you in this particular organization there's an atmosphere or a climate of safety in terms of sharing knowledge, and in this other organization there's a climate of unsafety, or people really intimidated or not willing to share. So this is an example of project characteristics. And motivation, which is important to our study, this was new, the effectiveness and safety we assessed. I'll show you that. And this looks like a very minute study at first glance, but this involved tons and tons of hours of the first author looking, observing, interviewing, documenting, in short, a lot of work. So, okay, I've gone through this. This is the life cycle that they used. And here, this is the lucky part. Very quickly exhausted, I like that. But these are the stamps that the company did. This was at some point put into organization-wide system that's called PLM. And you deal with that. And at any point, we could look at an item, one of these objects, and say, were they in the status of draft, exhibit, enable, and deliverable? So the most immature was draft, where there was not much information. In fact, they had 3 dimensions, according to which the first two were actually dictated numerically. You could put a number to it, and stability was more of an assessment. So this is, for example, most object fields are still empty. The weight, the color, the materials, whatever you want in the BOM were empty, and precision information collected is not validated. These were actually yes, no here, and here was simply a count. These BOMs of bills of materials are pretty big. And here, people considered, the experts in the project, considered the object considered as not stable. Let me jump to the highest level, deliverable. Object content is considered as stable. That's it. There's no use in going and working more, or asking more questions. It's stable in the sense that it's ready to work for us. Okay. So we had this. And constructing the interpersonal network, we managed to do that with interviews. I'm going into that unless you ask. Climate, this is that questionnaire that I mentioned. And let me show you a minute what we're talking about. So this is, look at the dimensions here. This here is the levels or the stages of the life cycle. Scoping, build, business case, development. These are words that the organization gave us. Validation. Okay? Only after validation we can go into launch. One depends on another. The different objects, for example, technical or marketing specification, starts very early. You need something already at the level of scoping. And then look at the index down here. There's draft, exhibit, enable, and deliverable. So it begins with draft. I'm looking at the marketing specification. Draft, exhibit, which is slightly better, and the enabled, and finally the deliverable. What's important, and here I'm digressing a minute from the particular specific object of marketing, is also the interrelationship between. Very often, one depends on another. For example, the 3D drawing begins here only after we have some beginning of technical specifications and a little bit more advanced marketing specifications. Before that, we can't start talking about the 3D. Remember the picture of the iron, for example. We are going to, right now, I'm going to show you results of one. It's the 3D drawing, which is considered a more advanced representation. There's one even more advanced, and that is a prototype, a working prototype. This is still, the 3D is a drawing, but it's already got 3 dimensions, and it's very, very specific and relatively accurate representation of the final product. Okay. We started out, but it figured that very quickly we decided that it's too complex. So we later simplified it, and I'll show you the simplification. But we started out with this kind of graph that shows the pattern of knowledge maturation. On the one hand, we've already seen the stages of the life cycle. And here we're adding the dimension, the other dimension of the knowledge networks. The particular object is in terms of these 2 dimensions. I see some of you can't see the lower level. So look at this one here. This one, the first thing we know is that it is, if you see here the legend, it's an exhibit. It's after a draft, but still before enable. Sorry, this one here. But we can also map it. It's done at the stage of build business case and at the level of the project. Before that, it was shared only, going back a step, only at the level of the interpersonal. The person didn't want to give it out to the entire project team. And after, at some stage, it will need to get to, here it's not yet there, to the organization. When, by the way, does it get to the organization? Only when it's a deliverable. These are the rules of the game there. Just a side comment. The organization is very good in terms of innovation and pretty effective in terms of enforcing, we discovered only a few outliers, enforcing when people share at the extremes, but not in the middle. They have no idea what's happening in the middle. Okay. So what we see here is a classic view of what we would expect is that the object becomes more and more mature until it becomes deliverable. And it grows. At the beginning, I work by myself, and then it grows. And of course, it has to, and this is where the organization can put in the formal coercion. This is the red one. We, the organization, insist, require that this becomes deliverable before we can go on to the next stage of testing. And these are big meetings with project managers and general managers to give the stamp. Yes, it's now a deliverable, and only now you can go to the next stage of testing. It's a big ceremony here. Okay, so we quickly discovered that this graph is a little too complicated. We changed it to this, and now what we could do, we could also, let me go back a minute. Yeah. And this is where I was happy with the results. We could explain the transitions by looking back at safety and effectiveness. What are the transitions? The transitions are first going from personal to interpersonal. We simply interviewed. Here it was through Valerie, the first author, but we guided him how to interview and what to ask, so that we could determine why, this is the A here, why people actually went from one level to another, in other words, from personal to interpersonal. Why did people do that? Did they feel safe? Was it a effectiveness? Was it a combination? But what we managed to do is to explain these transitions with these two factors. We didn't find other factors, or we didn't need them. This is this table here. I see you looking. 8? Okay, so we did other patterns, and we can go into it. And here we've got 4 and later 12, but let's look at the 4. And here, this is where we start speculating a little bit. So I'll be happy to hear your comments. First of all, we had this additional context characteristic called climate of safety by Edmondson. And if you look a minute at the project, these here on the left-hand side are where we have what we call limited or low safety, and these two where we had high safety. What I'm trying now to do is develop some kind of more quantitative measure for this, but basically what we see is in the limited, people go to share information to the project much more slowly than when people feel safe. And it's documented also in terms of their explanations, giving stories, what happens to them when they share information where the climate is the wrong climate. They get all kinds of, they get punished in various ways. Okay. Until they're told what to do. When I say politically, for example, they might get, they lose some kind of advantage or political stature in the organization by sharing too quickly. This goes against effectiveness, because what we saw, the earlier, this is a key idea of sharing information to develop knowledge, the earlier you share, the faster you get more perspectives and different critical remarks that save you a lot of time later down the line. Improve things. And the aesthetics comes to mind because the aesthetics person was not involved in one of these cases. It came in only later, and then they had to redesign some of the aspects. And all this was because he was not in the loop for all kinds of safety reasons. So what we're trying to do now is to analyze, we've got, as I said, 12. We chose 6 that have a better climate of safety and 6 that don't. And we're trying to analyze and compare these patterns where we're trying to see first how quickly people share, and also, at the beginning we thought it's negative, but it's not true at all. These different patterns of going up and down, taking a piece of work, getting information, going back to working as an individual, going up. These, at the first sight it might seem, oh, this is a waste of time. No, this is exactly the idea of the hermeneutics cycle, where you have to chew on the knowledge and get this enrichment to progress. So these, and that's where we're trying to, that's how I'm trying to summarize this study, trying to figure out when these ups and downs or these changes versus what you might look at the most efficient way of doing things, well, this is actually required. Sometimes with a better climate we could avoid this, but sometimes, and the hint is, when things are pretty complex, we need to encourage this going backwards and forwards using your interpersonal circles, the safety circles, because that's part of developing knowledge for complicated and complex products. So what I'm trying to do now, and that's where I want to finish, is to show when these different patterns occur, what can be done to avoid them when they're not necessary, but what should be done to support them when they are necessary. In other words, if we have a relatively straightforward product, it's innovative, it's new, it demands more knowledge, but it's not too complicated in terms of, for example, using a new kind of, for an iron, they had to look for a new way of making it concise so that it doesn't overheat. And they had to go into a new infrastructure. That's very complex, that's very complicated, and there are ways of measuring complexity, or novelty. But in the case where that isn't so complicated, this would not be necessary and could be avoided if we had a higher climate of safety. So I'm trying to identify when these patterns are required, when they're not necessary. That's one of the issues. The other issue is to hammer in this idea that effectiveness and safety can explain how knowledge is shared to develop. In this context, I don't want to go beyond product development, but I think it reflects a lot of other ideas, and this importance that you can encourage people to think individually to a point. Beyond that, you have to share. These are the conceptual ideas, and one hint towards the implications for IT. IT does a good job at the beginning and end. It does not support, usually, you don't see many systems that actually have this stamp of these statuses, but more importantly, in this PLM, in this particular system, when you share, you have to share to the entire organization, to the entire project, sorry. If you wanted to share with your friends, you put it on a disk or send them a private email. That's not good, because then it's much harder later to share effectively to everybody. The system has, at the minimum, has to be sensitive to the idea that sometimes you want to share knowledge to a smaller, restricted, safe circle. So those are the kind of ideas that I want to push forward. But this, I think I showed you the essence. Any ideas on how to analyze these different patterns, highly appreciated. What you think in general, highly appreciated. So I hope we've got a few minutes. Please.
Thank you. Questions? Judith?
I have a question.
Sure.
How does crowdsourcing change that pattern?
Okay, well, I think you walked in a little late, right? No, because my motivation at the beginning, part of the motivation was to stir your attention by saying crowdsourcing today is the trend. And what I'm worried about is that we throw the baby with the dirty water. And that is, we neglect or oversee the huge potential of the value of what the organization itself has to offer, like these interpersonal networks. By the way, interpersonal networks can also be across the organization. If you've got somebody safe in another organization that you feel safe with, that's okay. But what I think is that this idea here says the organization still has a lot of value, and we can design technologies that support and enhance this value, not instead, but at least in addition to crowdsourcing. But relying only on crowdsourcing, I think, is a big, big mistake. Yes, please.
Thank you very much for a very interesting talk.
Sure.
I love knowledge management, so looking at it from a different perspective, of the strategic aspect. But my question, I mean, obviously you looked at the explicit knowledge, which was sort of,
Yeah.
so that the evidence is, how did you observe tacit knowledge?
I raise my hands here, and I say at the beginning I should have stressed this. I had on that graphic there was a solid line and a broken line, and the broken lines suggested around implicit that we did not observe directly. What we assume here, and it's a big assumption, is that there is this Nonaka's spiral that goes from implicit to explicit, and because of this drive of effectiveness to share knowledge, much of the knowledge is translated eventually into these diagrams or these knowledge objects. Why? Because, as I showed you, the company works. This is like an infrastructure for project management, if you will. It works through these objects. What is not captured in the objects will not be sanctioned, and therefore will hold the whole advancement. So, unfortunately, we haven't got a direct measure of implicit knowledge.
Right, okay. So that takes me to the
Next
second question, or perhaps
The killer.
comment, is that obviously Nonok has been sort of critiqued heavily for basically relying on Polanyi's sort of tacit explicit dimension, and we've got somebody in Cardiff University, Harry Collins, who's actually taken that debate further in terms of the different dimensions of tacit knowledge. One of them is, for instance, interactional expertise. One of them is contributory expertise. With regards to the complex products, different expertise are coming together, right? But do they speak the same language? So would that dimension of tacit knowledge be able to help you to make sense of some of those ups and downs, and where would that be helpful or not?
Excellent question. I mean, I haven't got a. It's an excellent, even though I haven't got an answer. But what I want to say is that part of this issue of safety very often alludes to the fact that people are of different minds, right? And being able to form these, training people to form these interpersonal circles, even though they are of different minds, I think would be very beneficial. Absolutely, absolutely. What we haven't traced, though, is the composition of these interpersonal networks in terms of diversity. We looked only at, and we asked people, how comfortable do you feel? How safe do you feel? Are these people providing you constructive feedback? These are the kinds of questions we asked to form these interpersonal. Maybe we should also look into the diversity of perspectives, absolutely. By the way, that also has huge implications on IT, and I studied that. Today, people don't record that information in any way, and don't really, in information systems, don't leverage that kind of knowledge. It's a pity, but we should. We absolutely should. Yeah. Thanks.
Kelly.
Thank you very much. Very nice topic. I enjoyed it.
Thanks.
I have a couple of questions on how we're talking at you. The first one is I'm really looking at that diagram, the one that you can see the knowledge is going up and down. And I was wondering, does the organization culture play a big role in that, especially
I think
motivation, whether that is a positive motivation or...
Well, I think so. That's what I was saying, that this is one of the project characteristics, although Edmondson used it for organizations. We're using the same idea to compare projects. Because, in the same organization, you might have a project with a lot of good atmosphere and others that are detrimental. But, so yes, definitely that explains how fast we go in to share, and also when we have some problem and we documented that. When we have some problem, we go back, narrow in, and stay with ourselves or very close friends for a while, simply because we're afraid to share to the project level. Because in the project level we have also marketing guys and financial guys and all kinds of people who give us a hard time. But what I'm claiming is that it's not necessarily detrimental, these ups and downs. They're sometimes necessary, as I said, for complicated, maybe for other cases as well, but for complicated we've seen that this is the essence of what we call the hermeneutic cycle. So,
another question is regarding the safety and the effectiveness. Does the effectiveness, for example, depend or play a big role when it comes to the project, whether that project is a competitive project to others?
yeah, this is by definition.
Yeah.
The effectiveness is the need to develop the knowledge in order to go further, progress with the product. By definition, effectiveness is tied to how good the product is, how fast we get it into the market, all the elements that you would consider success of product development.
Mark?
Did you, hi, very good talk, I mean, very interesting. Did you do a tracing on the business case as a knowledge object as well? I'd be particularly interested because there's often with a business case from personal experience and
Yes.
major, more civil engineering projects in the public sector in particular, you share the business case with a very limited audience.
That's right.
And you often share it with people at a very late time in which they couldn't change the business case, so for political reasons.
Right.
I'm particularly interested.
Okay, I haven't got it here, but it really depends on the knowledge object that you choose.
Yeah.
So the interesting is the marketing object, which is prevalent during the business case. I haven't got it here analyzed, but at some point we wanted to show what happens to the 3D, which to us was kind of attractive, also happens maybe in different patterns to other objects earlier in the life cycle. But so if I would rephrase it to say not what happened in the business case, but which object to choose, and we're definitely going to concentrate. You're right. I think there's a lot of politics there.
There are in this case.
You're absolutely right, and that's part of the safety.
It is.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes.
Because often, like I said, you would share it, on a major investment, share it very late, in which case they couldn't change things. It was just too late. So they'd be sharing a small circle, like finance director.
So what we found here, by the way, is that the interpersonal circles of the marketing guy were very close,
Yeah, sure.
and the technical were afraid.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah,
So they kept it on.
Yeah.
Okay.
Other questions? A question from me. When you were considering the motivations and you've spoken of Edmondson, did you also consider Herzberg or Maslow and why weren't they?
Yeah, I try to, as I said, by the way, people who are interested, this idea of effectiveness and safety are not new. They are used pretty intensively in social network analysis, okay, but in a different way. Some commonalities, but pretty different. What I'm saying here is that I think the two major motivators for developing knowledge or sharing knowledge for development are these two. There might be others.
Yes.
I don't want to confuse you. Edmondson spoke about psychological safety. To me, that's the climate of the project or the organization, the climate of safety. I'm using maybe, but that's the way other people have used it, the word safety not as part of the climate, but as a motivator for sharing information. That's not taken from Edmondson.
Right.
It might be confusing, the word safety pops up. One is a climate, Edmondson's climate of safety, and it's so relevant because the motivator or the driver for sharing or very often not sharing is safety. So they tie together, but this one is measured as a climate of the project and one as what do I feel as an actor.
Thank you. Any others? Well, thank you, Dov.
Thank you. Thank you for your attention.